Venezuelan opposition figure Juan Guaido is in hot water after pictures of him with Colombian narco-paramilitaries surfaced. Thousands bid farewell to Zimbabwe's founding father, Robert Mugabe. And citizens of Hong Kong gather to celebrate their Chinese roots and call for an end to violent anti-China protests. From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I'm Camila Escalante. Recently released pictures of Venezuelan opposition figure Juan Guaido in the company of Colombian narco-paramilitaries confirm accusations made by the government that Venezuela's right wing has long had a working relationship with criminal groups. We have more in this report.
Opposition lawmaker Juan Guaido is once again under investigation by the prosecutor's office due to his links to paramilitary groups, who allegedly helped him exit the country on February 22nd by evading migration points. But there are also others in his inner circle who have close links to these criminal gangs.
Se trató de una operación de extracción.
Guaido's crossing into Colombia in February this year was an extraction operation by Colombian narco-paramilitaries. They provided him with security and escorts to cross the border from La Palmita in the Venezuelan state of Táchira to Puerto Santander in Colombia. The paramilitaries placed these communities under a 24-hour curfew to avoid Guaido being seen. That was part of the agreement.
Por más de 24 horas a toque de queda paramilitar.
I am certain that it was former Colombian President Álvaro Uribe who ordered the Rastrojos to help and protect the Queen of the South, Juan Guaido.
Meanwhile, Colombian President Iván Duque confirmed that protection was provided to Guaido.
When President Guaido came to Colombia at the start of this year, we helped him enter Colombia safely. We welcome him here and provide protection for him during his stay.
For his part, Guaido tried to downplay this scandal by saying that everyone he meets asks for pictures, but he failed to explain why one of the men was armed. According to the government, in just the past 2 months, 62 heavily armed paramilitaries were captured in Venezuelan territory, while another 12 died in clashes.
There are 4 paramilitary groups at the border: the Rastrojos gang, the Urabeños, the Gulf Cartel, and another cartel line which is led by a highly dangerous individual who goes by the alias El Paisa. These gangs had been taking control of the border and were behind many horrible crimes.
Still, the United States and their allies continue their attempts at ousting President Nicolás Maduro. The latest one is calling for the activation of the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance at the OAS, which could open the door for military intervention.
Every policy used against us was first planned by the U.S. State Department. They are the ones giving orders to the Venezuelan opposition and to subservient governments like Chile, Colombia, and Paraguay. We have said it countless times. The Rio Treaty is a mechanism used by the United States to move forward in conquering Latin America once again. Historically, it has proven to be detrimental to Latin America, as it was during the Malvinas War when the U.S. supported Great Britain instead of Argentina.
So far, Cuba, Uruguay, and Mexico have opposed a military option, as proposed by the United States, as Guaido's allies keep quiet about his close relationship to criminal paramilitary groups.
Hurricane Dorian survivors in the Bahamas have crowded shelters as another tropical storm carrying heavy rain and strong winds threatens the already battered islands. Tropical storm Humberto is now hovering over central Bahamas, packing winds of 45 kilometers per hour. The storm is expected to drop 2 to 4 inches of rain through to Sunday, although no significant storm surge is predicted. Officials have also erected large tents in Nassau and plan to do the same on Abaco to shelter up to 4,000 people. According to the Bahamian government, 1,300 people are still missing, and relief services are focusing on search and rescue missions as well as providing food, water, and shelter to survivors. Foreign leaders and supporters of Zimbabwe's founding father, Robert Mugabe, gathered on Saturday at the National Stadium to say their goodbyes. Mugabe, who died at the age of 75, will be buried in a mausoleum at the Heroes Acre in Harare in about 30 days. Mugabe ruled Zimbabwe for 37 years until he was ousted by the army in November 2017. He died in Singapore a week ago. African leaders and senior officials from Cuba, Russia, and China have praised Mugabe as a Pan-African hero for his past as a colonial-era guerrilla leader.
A giant tree of Africa has fallen. Indeed, the bold, steadfast, and resolute revolutionary Comrade Robert Gabriel Mugabe is no more, taken away from us, the people he fought hard to free, liberate, and empower us.
He was a visionary leader and a relentless champion of African dignity. The late President Mugabe has left an indelible mark in the history of Zimbabwe and the African continent at large through his political astuteness and zeal for the economic and political liberation of Africa.
Meanwhile, speaking during the funeral ceremony, South Africa's president apologized for the wave of riots and xenophobic attacks that hit his nation in recent weeks. Cyril Ramaphosa said that the events were against the principle of African unity, for which leaders like Nelson Mandela and Robert Mugabe fought.
This has led, as I can hear you are responding to the deaths and injuries of a number of people, some of whom were nationals from other countries, and the majority were South Africans. I stand before you as a fellow African to express my regret and to apologize for what has happened in our country.
Ballot boxes and security personnel have been deployed to polling stations across Tunisia ahead of presidential elections on Sunday. 26 candidates, including the current prime minister and defense minister, are vying for the position. These elections were moved up after the death of incumbent president Beji Caid Essebsi in July of this year, and will be the second presidential election since the fall of longtime leader Ben Ali in 2011. In France, Yellow Vest protesters took to the streets of Nantes on Saturday, marking the 44th consecutive weekend of mobilizations against the government of Emmanuel Macron. Hundreds of demonstrators faced off with police in a tense standoff before the police fired tear gas to disperse protesters who had smashed the fronts of a travel agency and a McDonald's restaurant. According to officials, at least 21 people have been arrested.
We still have the same demands, and as long as we don't get them, the anger will remain there. You're not going to calm people's anger by sending in the riot police and giving us a €100 bonus at the end of the year. People are fed up. They are fed up. At the beginning in those early protests, I didn't completely agree with people saying, Macron resign. But now, seeing how he's behaving towards us, 9 months sending riot police, tearing gassing people, hitting people, injuring people, despite what we're telling him, I think he really has to resign so we can put someone else there instead.
John Bolton's unceremonious exit from the White House earlier this week has created some uncertainty about what route the Trump administration will now follow when it comes to foreign policy, in particular when it comes to Iran. Our correspondent in Washington, Alina Duarte, has more.
Expectations are high for what's next in the U.S. foreign policy after the removal of far-right hunk John Bolton as National Security Advisor. Many wonder how will the U.S. relationships with North Korea, Afghanistan, Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran develop now. And in the latter cases, the question is even more complex as bilateral tensions have been on the rise, given since the U.S. walked away from the 2015 nuclear deal and reimposed numerous economic sanctions.
There's this maximum pressure campaign that Trump keeps talking about, and it's a series of executive orders and laws that basically cut off Iran and specific individuals from the world financial system. So it's very hard for Iran to...
Las sanciones contra Irán se reanudaron luego de que unilateralmente Estados Unidos decidiera retirarse del acuerdo nuclear con la nación persa, que había costado largos años de negociaciones.
Since May of 2018, oil production in Iran has fallen sharply, dropping by 40%. And the damage is not only getting worse, as exemptions granted by the U.S. to oil buyers in order to do business with Iran have recently expired. Experts agree that the mainstream media has been instrumental in spreading anti-Iran propaganda.
Most people don't understand what sanctions are, and they think they're targeting specific people. They also think that Iran is, building a nuclear weapon to attack people, and there's not much evidence of the latter. Iran has, entered into the Iran deal. European countries were very happy with the Iran deal because it allowed them to import Iranian oil.
One of the main supporters of this so-called maximum pressure campaign against Iran was former National Security Advisor John Bolton. But despite his exit, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has said that the U.S. strategy will remain the same. But the Iran government has fired back at this.
U.S. citizens need to understand that warmongers are not beneficial to them. That country needs to abandon war and their maximum pressure policies.
Policies that are also being used against a nation like Venezuela, and that, according to the DC-based Center for Economic and Policy Research, have caused the deaths of at least 40,000 Venezuelans.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again in a minute. Welcome back. Hundreds of Hong Kong residents participated in an activity on Lion Rock Hill to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. With Chinese national flags in hand, they sang the national anthem of China, saying it's an honor to be Chinese and a Hong Kong resident. Those who attended also called for an end to the unrest in Hong Kong, with hope that things will soon return to normal. And for the most part, those sometimes violent demonstrations have simmered down. Senior editor and China Daily, Ian Goodrum, joins us now from Beijing. Hey Ian, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
What is the latest on the protests now that the bill that seemed to be at the center of the demonstrations has been withdrawn?
Well, there's some scattered activity. We've not seen anything on the scale of previous events. I think that the actual withdrawal of the bill as opposed to the suspension, even though is really just a semantic difference. I mean, there was very little chance of the bill after being suspended actually being put forward again. But now that it's actually been withdrawn, that was a major demand that was being articulated by the protesters at first. Now, of course, it eventually grew to encompass many more demands as the protesters got more emboldened and a little bit more violent. But the major one was, of course, related to this bill, which has now been totally withdrawn. I mean, it's entirely possible that we get another major happening, but it's unlikely, it seems like to me.
All right, so beyond that bill, other issues have been brought up, like you said, including talk on electoral reform and talk about lack of freedom. Can you tell us a bit about these issues?
Yeah, there's, well, as I said, the demands increased and got a little bit more expansive in scope as the protesters got emboldened, in part because of the support they were receiving from politicians and media organizations in the West. So it turned into a much larger kind of quote-unquote democratic rights protest when at first it was a pretty localized response to a very local issue. The change has been to this new system, this system that some, it's not a representative portion, I don't think, of people in Hong Kong want. And so that would mean eliminating what are called the functional constituencies, which are electoral districts that make up about half of the Legislative Council, what some of the protesters are asking for. And again, I have to emphasize some, is a kind of Western style representative democracy, one person, one vote kind of a thing. Now, this is, this could be a reasonable demand in an environment where there wasn't vandalism against metro stations and vandalizing trade union facilities and workers' clubs. But in the context of that, it becomes a more heated kind of demand to make. And so things got a little dicey. Things got quite heated for a while.
Now, U.S. Senator Marco Rubio has this line that the defense of human rights and democracy are in the moral and national interests of the United States. And for that reason, he's promoting the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. What is that all about?
This is just the latest. I mean, especially Rubio, of course. We know very well what his stance is on these sorts of things. This is just another episode of political theater. It's filled with the same basic kind of language you're going to see in any kind of legislation that is ostensibly meant to protect quote unquote human rights and democracy, but is in fact just another means by which politicians can demonize and attempt to fracture and isolate countries that do not toe the U.S. line, in this case China. We've seen it before with similar bills targeted at Venezuela, Cuba, you name it. Tons of countries, anybody who doesn't conform to the Washington consensus. So, the standard kind of we defend democracy, we defend human rights, et cetera, kind of grandstanding that we've seen time and time again from lots of politicians, but especially Rubio.
A lot of people in the United States and around the world have shown sympathy and actually very enthusiastic support for these protests, which we know have turned at times violent, like you said, and some people have even compared them to the guarimbas in Venezuela. How would you describe what you've seen? You kind of went through it before, but what have you seen from there? I mean, we see what we see here, which is people fighting for democracy is what their placards say.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is who and what have been targeted by the violence. It hasn't been the actual, because there are local issues in Hong Kong that people want resolved. There are things that people want that people want a better life for themselves. Housing is ridiculously expensive. It's getting to New York-like conditions, shall we say? And there is a system of kind of domestic help that is akin to indentured servitude, not quite, but getting there. And this is because of this is a holdover of the British system, right? This is part of the compromise that Beijing had to make in order to make the transition to a Chinese Hong Kong peaceful as opposed to violent and based in military action. So you had to compromise and you had to accommodate the existing power structure, and that included quite a few business elites, real estate elites. And these are the people that are continuing this divide, that are maintaining this divide. But the protests haven't targeted those people, haven't targeted the people that are actually responsible. They've been turned toward the mainland and the central government in Beijing because they feel like that's the better target of their blame. Now, this could not be further from the truth. In fact, if Hong Kong had a system similar to the mainland, then a lot of these issues would not exist anymore. There would be a lot more public utilities to use to resolve these problems and to ratchet down prices. But anyway, the targets of the violence have not, as I've said, have not been those groups. The financial centers haven't been targeted. It's been metro stations, airports, things regular people use, which that is certainly a tactic one could use, but it is not a good way to get the masses on your side. So we're seeing a lot of, I mean, the priorities need to be thought about. You know, who gets harmed by the metro station shutting down? Who uses the metro? Well, it's not the people who can afford private air or private driving. Those people are getting around just fine with the protests. I mean, they might be mildly inconvenienced in some way. The airport it does include private planes, but the vast majority of people affected by this violence are regular working people. So you have to think about, again, who is being targeted, what their priorities are in targeting them. You know, whatever their actual intent might be, the real result is that regular people are harmed by this. And so despite whatever pictures people might want to show of marches getting big turnout, especially now, after the withdrawal of the bill, but also after some of the worst episodes of violence, including the kind of taking hostage of a couple of mainland Chinese people at the airport and attacking and beating until they were unconscious. The tide turned a little bit, and so these kinds of actions have kind of alienated people because of what they've chosen to target. And you mentioned the guarimbas as well. I think that's a perfect comparison because, again, this is like a fiery barricade kind of situation where there's great potential for escalation and further violence and harm. So I think that's an apt comparison. I think the playbook is quite similar.
Yeah, and I think in all protest movements, symbolism is really important. I want to ask you about that. The symbolism which is being used, we've seen US flags, UK flags, this frog character, some anarchist representations, I would say. It doesn't have some of the characteristics of a liberation movement that you'd expect to see. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a great look for if you're trying to get the people on your side. I mean, certainly there are people in Hong Kong who are nostalgic for the colonial period. They don't remember the fact that racial discrimination wasn't wasn't technically outlawed until 1991 and wasn't explicitly outlawed until after the handover. So that meant that there was all kinds of job discrimination happening against Chinese, lots of preferential treatment for the British, places where the British could go, the Chinese couldn't, jobs the British could do, the Chinese could not. English was the official language in Hong Kong for almost its entire colonial history, with no accommodation for Cantonese or Mandarin or any Chinese dialect. And so people either have short memories or they've kind of gotten into this almost Stockholm syndrome, where they've convinced themselves that things are so bad that British colonialism or U.S. neocolonialism would be preferable. Now, we know better than that. We know exactly what happens when the U.S. liberates a place. We know from countless countries and countless places where we've seen firsthand the results of U.S. liberation. But this doesn't seem to matter to some of those people. Now, I will say that obviously they don't make up the entirety of the movement or the protest, shall we say. But it is certainly a sizable enough minority to give us pause. I mean, clearly there are people with short memories or a kind of, identifying with one's captors, that it is certainly able to influence the protest to some degree. And then, of course, the frog symbol, of course, people have tried to excuse that, even though it's very well known to be a kind of white supremacist right-wing figure now, kind of co-opted by right-wing meme people. Hong Kong people are not unaware of this. They have access to the same information that the alt-righters have. They know very well what it means. But again, this is indicative of a certain strain of the protest. It's not. I mean, certainly everybody who's been out in the streets at the street level is not waving U.S. flags, but it certainly reflects a mentality that is present, that is there, that should be noticed and should be pointed out and criticized. The violence that's taken place there is not what I would actually call radical violence, because it is violence in service of a status quo in service of imperialist hegemony that doesn't actually do anything to change the way things are. Radicalism changes the way things are, and these protesters, these Hong Kong people who have taken up the Molotov cocktail, do so in service of splintering China, and which will ultimately serve the interests of the imperialist West, which is not radical at all. It's reactionary. It protects all the existing class interests. So really, I mean, they've really got things backward.
We thank Ian Goodrum, senior editor at China Daily, for the great insight and for taking the time to join us from Beijing. And now we've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at tellusenglish.net. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Tell Us Our English, I'm Camila Escalante. Thanks for watching.